What's up, guys? Welcome to The Smart Student. My name is Chelsea Seaburn, and this is video number 4 in the mini-series where we're talking about Harvard referencing style. And this video in particular is very important because we're going to cover in-text citations. And of course, I have a full PDF downloadable template of everything I'm going to cover in this video. You can find it in the description. With that, let's go ahead and jump into my computer and get this party started. So let's go ahead and start, as promised, with building the relationship between a reference list entry and an in-text citation. So quite frankly, these two components combined is the entire process of referencing a source. So a lot of times you hear the word reference being thrown around. Sometimes reference means building a reference list entry, but other times reference means referencing the source. And to fully do this, you have to create the reference list entry and the in-text citation. In other words, just creating the reference list entry is not enough. You have to create the in-text citation as well, and here's why. So the purpose is in the name. So in-text citation. This means that you're including a citation within the text of your writing, within the wording, because that's how you're going to identify the material that came from somewhere else. If it was paraphrased, directly quoted, doesn't matter. If the idea you're presenting in your paper came from another source, you have to cite it. And so the in-text citation signals that information in your paper, which links it back to your reference list entry. From there, you can look up the original source. So as you can see, the in-text citation reference list entry, they're linked together with the purpose of bringing you back to the original source. So that way the source is credited, you can find it, you can locate it, you're covered on all bases. Now let's move on to how this translates into formatting. So in the 2 previous Harvard referencing lessons, we uncovered the 4 elements of a reference list entry, and then we went through examples of building reference list entries. And so the color coordination is really important here because, as you'll note, the 4 elements of the full reference list entry, you have the author, the date, the title, and the source. Now, going down to the in-text citation, Harvard referencing follows an author-date formatting for the in-text citation, meaning that you're going to include the author's last name, followed by a comma, and then the date, which is simply going to be the year of publication, which is going to look like this. So as you can see, in the full reference list entry, here's our example. The author is Keeling. The date is 2020. So coming down to our citation, that's how it's going to translate out. Now, if you'll notice, we have 2 different citations here. Well, because one is for paraphrase material, the other is for direct quotes. The difference between these 2 is that paraphrase material is using someone else's ideas, thoughts, whatever, but you're rewording it in your own words, creating a new piece of writing. Whereas a direct quote, you're copying their exact words verbatim and using that quote within your paper. Okay. Looking at the formatting, the only thing that's different is for a direct quote, you need to include a source locator. In other words, something that pinpoints the exact location where someone can find this direct quote. Very important that you do that since you are using the author's information verbatim. An important note about the source locator is that know this, there are not predetermined formatting principles for the different type of sources. You're simply going to use something that pinpoints to that direct quote. So here we have the abbreviation for paragraph, which is para 9. So let's say this was an online article. There were no main headings that I could use for the source locator. There's no page numbers. Well, then I'm going to identify the paragraph number. If it's a PowerPoint, your source locator would be the slide number. If it's a book, it would be the page. If it's a video, it's going to be the timestamp. I'm sure you get the picture here. So let's move on to the next thing we need to cover before we can get to our examples. And that is the 2 different formatting options you have when creating an in-text citation. Because when you're creating a citation, you can format it as a parenthetical citation or a narrative citation. And as you can see, it doesn't matter if it's paraphrased or directly quoted, you can apply these formatting principles to either one. So let's go ahead and start with paraphrase material. And let's take a look at the parenthetical citation. So again, this is exactly what it sounds like. This is when the elements are enclosed in parentheses like you see they are here. And just a reminder, since this is paraphrased material, it's not a direct quote, well, you don't need to include a source locator. The author and the year is perfect. Now, let's talk about a narrative citation. So this is when you're going to incorporate the citation elements into the wording of the sentence. So as you can see here, we have the author's last name as a part of the sentence. So as Keeling 2022 explains an effective time management strategy, blah, blah, blah. For narrative citations, the date is typically enclosed in parentheses behind the author's last name. However, you're welcome to incorporate the date as well. This sentence might read something like, in 2022, Keeling explained la la la. Okay, now let's take a look at a direct quote. And we're going to simply apply the principles we just learned, except now we're using the author's words verbatim. So when you're formatting a direct quote, you need to enclose that quote in double quotations to signify the borrowed material. It's very, very important you do that. Otherwise, your direct quote is not formatted correctly, and it's going to automatically flag for plagiarism. All right, taking a look at the parenthetical citation, we have the elements enclosed in parentheses. It's a direct quote, so we're including the source locator. And note how the parenthetical citation, I'm including it after the direct quote, so it's outside the second double quotation, and the period is going to follow after the second parentheses to complete the full sentence. Now, moving on to the narrative citation for the direct quote. The first portion looks just like the previous example. We have the author's last name incorporated to the sentence, followed by the year enclosed in parentheses. The difference here is that we're now going to include the source locator after the direct quote, and again, it's enclosed in parentheses, and we have that period to finish out the sentence. Cool? Guess what? Now we have the information we need to move on to building in-text citations. So now we're going to cover all the different scenarios you might run into, starting with a citation that has one author. And quite frankly, you already know how to do this because this is exactly what I showcased in the previous examples. So if you have one author, you're including the author's last name, followed by a comma, and then the year of publication. Both of those elements are enclosed in parentheses. And remember, you have the option to format it as a paraphrase citation or as a direct quote. Now, let's take this principle and let's talk about what to do when you have two authors. What you're going to do here, well, it's quite simple. You're going to include the last names of both of those authors separated by the word and, followed by a comma, and then the date remains the same. In other words, you have the year of publication just as it is there. An important note when it comes to creating citations for multiple authors, you're always going to type out the full word and. You're not going to use the ampersand symbol in its place. Just keep that in mind. But now let's talk about what you're going to do when you have three authors. And quite frankly, there's a theme here because again, we're going to build on the principles that we just learned, and that we're going to include the last name of all authors. We're going to separate the last two by the word and note that you're going to include a comma to separate the first two. So in other words, there's no Oxford comma, meaning there's no comma between the last two elements. You have the word and that's all you need. And guess what? That's exactly how you're going to format if you've chosen a narrative in-text citation. You have the author's last names all listed out, the first two separated by a comma, the last two, you have the word and. All right? Now let's talk about what you're going to do when you have four or more authors. So this is where the principle starts to change just a little bit, but don't worry, we're actually going to simplify the author element. So anytime you have four or more authors, you're going to include the first author's last name, followed by the abbreviation et al. Period. Et al. Means and others. What this does is it cleans up your writing because it's not bogged down with all these authors' last names while still fulfilling its purpose in that you can locate the reference list entry. All right, so same thing for the narrative. You're going to use the abbreviation et al. Now we're going to transition from the author element being a person or people, and let's talk about what to do when it's a group author. So a group author is simply when it's an organization, a corporation, maybe a university, a nonprofit, a government agency. I could keep going on, but again, I think you get the picture here. The group author simply means that it's not a person or people. And you actually have two variations when it comes to creating the in-text citation. So what you can do is follow standard protocol, in that you're going to include the author element, so World Health Organization, followed by a comma, the year of publication. However, if you're going to reference this source multiple times within your paper, you can also include the abbreviation. So in the first citation, you are going to type out the full organization, followed by the abbreviation in square brackets. So that way, in the preceding citations, you're able to use the abbreviation only. This is simply another strategy used to clean up the text in your writing. Now let's move on to different scenarios when it comes to creating in-text citations. So this is when something is missing. And well, you only have two elements. So the first one is going to be when the author is missing, and then we're going to discuss what to do when there's no date. So let's go ahead and zoom back in here. Starting with the first one, this is an unknown author. There's no group author listed, there's no people listed. The rule of thumb here is you're always going to defer to the first element of the reference list entry. Remember, we're using the author element, so that way it's easy to identify which citation belongs to which reference, so it kind of makes sense that you're simply going to use the first element when the author is missing. And so when you're referencing a source that has no author, the title is automatically bumped up to the first element, so that's exactly what you're going to use for the author element in your in-text citation. You're going to replace it with the title. So here we have quick guide to Harvard referencing. Note that the citation formatting reflects the referencing formatting. Finally, if the title is lengthy, what you're going to do is condense the title into a brief, concise phrase. So this example isn't too lengthy, so it's okay to include the full title. But let's say there were quite a few other words in this title and I wanted to condense this. I might condense it to simply say quick guide. Why? Well, because this is nice and clean, but also quick guide, that's what the reader would need to easily spot the full reference list entry at the end of my paper. All right, so now let's talk about what you're going to do when there's no publication date. So there's no year available for you to include in the no date portion of the citation. Well, same thing as we just did before. You're simply going to match the date portion of the reference list entry to your in-text citation. And so how you format a reference list entry when there is no date is, well, you type out the word no date like you see it is here. Note that neither of those words are capitalized. And with that, that closes out the in-text citation for a source that doesn't have a date. Cool? Got it? Fantastic? Moving on. I'm excited because we're officially at the last two scenarios for this entire example tutorial. So let's go ahead and start with the first one, citing more than one study at a time. Now, you will run into this situation when, let's say you're researching a topic and you've read about this topic in 3 different sources and you've built your paraphrase based on the information from those 3 sources. So your paraphrase isn't based on any one source, it's a combination, a consolidation, if you will, of 3 different sources. Here's how it's going to translate into the in-text citation. You're going to take all the formatting principles relevant to each citation and you're simply going to combine them and separate them using a semicolon. So as you can see in the first example, we have our citation that had 4 or more authors. So we have Dietz et al. Next, we have the citation that had 3 authors. So we have Daniels, Patterson, and Dutson. And then finally, we have the example of a citation when there's just 2 authors, Soto and John. So easy peasy, you're just including all the citations in their normal formatting, again separated by a semicolon, pardon me. Now let's talk about what you're going to do when you have two different sources, but the in-text citation elements are the same. So you might run into this situation when the sources have the same author and also they're published within the same year. So what you're going to do in this situation is you're going to match your in-text citations to the reference list entry. In Harvard's rule for building reference list entries when the citation elements are the same is you're going to use a lowercase letter in the date element to signify which is which. So that way, when you build your in-text citations, you can clearly link the in-text citation to its respective reference list entry. All right. So at this point, if you've watched all 4 videos on Harvard referencing style, you should have a pretty good understanding of how to format your papers in Harvard referencing style. But of course, if you have any questions, comments, or hey, if you want me to cover something in detail, say maybe creating an outline for a Harvard referencing paper or section headings, anything in the realm of Harvard referencing style, if you want me to cover it, leave it down in the description below. Download this template if you haven't already, and I will see you guys in the next video.